So this is the Deschutes Basin. It's about 10,000 square miles, I believe. My notes here. 10,500 square miles. You can see that it originates in the High Cascades and then it flows out to the Columbia River northward. Actually, one thing I should say is, so within this whole basin here, we're going to spend a lot of time today. Actually, maybe I can do this with a pointer. We're going to spend a lot of time today talking about just this portion, what's called the Upper Deschutes Basin. All right. So to give a little sense of context, this is the current water rights distribution in the Deschutes Basin. The majority of the water the majority of the water rights are allocated to agriculture. There is a pretty small amount of water allocated.
Can you talk a little louder?
Sorry. There we go. Is that better? No. Okay, I'll just try and talk loud. So the majority of the water rights in the basin are allocated to agriculture. There's a pretty small amount allocated to municipal and domestic uses. And a really important thing to point out about those proportions is that almost all of the agricultural water rights in the basin are for surface water, and almost all of the water rights for municipal and domestic uses are for groundwater. Groundwater and surface water in the basin are connected, but sometimes they are more physically connected than other times, and sometimes they are more legally connected than other kinds, and we might get into some of that today, but most of what we're talking about today is agricultural water delivery in the basin. So, sorry, question?
What is in-stream?
So in-stream, since the 1980s, it is actually possible to file for water rights to just have water in the stream. So
To take it from that?
basically to leave the water in the stream where it's flowing.
It's protected in stream. You can't take it out.
That's the way to think about it, because basically if there was available water in a system prior to the 1980s, somebody could come in with an application to divert it. So people said, well, we want to be able to protect water in stream. We want that to actually be a legal right, and so they created an in-stream right structure in the 1980s. I probably don't have the numbers exactly right on this, but there's folks from the Deschutes River Conservancy who probably have more precise numbers than I do. But just to give you a sense of what these percentages mean, the amount of agricultural water rights in the basin is over 700,000 acre feet. I think it's maybe 720,000, 725. And then that 2% municipal domestic, that is probably 45,000 acre feet at most. So 725,000 acre feet, 45,000 acre feet, just to kind of give you a sense of how much water we're talking about. And for those of you who didn't read your cheat sheet for today's presentation, an acre foot of water is enough water to essentially stack a foot of water on top of a football field or an acre of land. All right, this slide, since we are talking about agricultural water today, this slide helps you understand where agricultural water deliveries are going. Each of these color shaded polygons on this on this map represents one of our irrigation districts. There are 8 irrigation districts in the basin, and we talked about, we talked about water rights as allocations. You'll also see that next to each of the irrigation districts' names is a priority date. So in terms of water rights, basically the older your water right is, the more priority you have to get water if water is scarce on any given year. So if there's a drought, people with a more senior water right get the water first. People with less senior rights get the water later, if at all. And the other thing to understand about these rights is that some of these rights are for what's called live flow. So that says, if you have a live flow irrigation right, you are supposed to be taking that water out of the stream in real time during the summer. And some of these rights are for stored water. So some of the districts who came in, who got their rights later in the system, they said, well, there's not enough live flow left for us to have some of that. So, but we do know that there will be years when there's a significant amount there'll be a significant amount of water in the winter that could be stored and then utilized later on. So those stored water rights typically come connected to a reservoir. I hope that made sense. So that's one of the other things that the forum organizers asked me to talk about today was, why does agriculture have so much? Why are so many of the water rights in the basin allocated to agriculture? And this is kind of tied up with the history of the Western United States. Basically, back in the 80s, the number one concern of the U.S. government was settling the Western United States so that the Russians or the English, the British or the Mexicans or whoever couldn't claim that land. So there was an active effort to populate the Western United States, and as a result of that, the federal and the state governments gave away land and they gave away water in order to encourage people to settle and be prosperous agricultural new inhabitants of these new states in the West. Okay, this is probably the most complicated slide. So these two diagrams on the left and the right help you understand what the flow is like in the river in the winter and the summer currently, and just to give you a sense of how our winter and summer flows currently differ from what we would have without any diversions from the river, without any dams in the river. The Deschutes Basin, the Deschutes River, prehistorically, had a very even flow throughout the season, throughout the year, because of the unique geology of the basin. We could talk about that more if anybody wants to, but because of the unique geology of this basin, the flow was very consistent. And in the upper Deschutes, you might see, something around 600 cubic feet per second passing by any given point in the river all year round. So in order to provide water for farms, we have, number one, put diversions in the system, and number two, we put a reservoir or a couple of reservoirs in the system. And the net effect of the reservoir, the storage of water in the winter, and then the release of that water in the summer for agriculture, and the net effect of the diversions, typically, most of them are right around curve right in the vicinity of the city of Bend. The really big main diversion is just downstream, just upstream of the river house in Bend. Produces these, basically these flow patterns. So in the winter, we're storing water up in Wickiup Reservoir and some of the other reservoirs, and so the flow in the upper Deschutes and some of the tributaries is pretty small. Historically, it would get very, very small in the upper Deschutes, and now we have a lot more protected flow in the upper Deschutes at the very top of the system during the winter. Not as much as we need for the ecological values that we're concerned about. But so basically, we would store water in the winter. It would result in very modest flow in the upper Deschutes in the winter months, and then as the river proceeded down, springs would add more water until you get to Lake Billy Chinook, and just above Lake Billy Chinook, there was still a decent amount of flow. In the summertime, all that water that gets stored in Wickiup and other reservoirs is being released for agricultural use. Again, those are those stored water rights. And then you can see in this diagram, use the pointer again, I guess. Right around here, in the vicinity of Bend, much of the water gets diverted, and then below that point, in the summer, our real concern, in terms of very low flows, is in the middle Deschutes. But that is that chunk of the river. Many of the early conservation efforts were really targeted at restoring flow in the middle Deschutes. So now there is 60 to 130 CFS of protected flow in the middle Deschutes, where 30, 40 years ago there were times when the middle Deschutes in the middle of the summer would be completely dry. So one of the kind of take-home messages from the presentation today, we're going to get into a whole lot of details, but one of the important things to emphasize to folks is that we have been making progress in agriculture, conserving water so that there's more water to keep in the river at key times of year, and so that there's more water to share with junior irrigation rights holders. That's just at the high level. Susan?
On the diversion, that's where it goes out to the canals and to the farms, correct?
Yes.
Okay. Thank you.
So your slide listed percentage of water for various things, but the water rights are actually absolute amounts of water, right? It's not a percentage of the flow that is what's allocated to a water right holder.
That's right, yeah. So it's, if you get a water right, it's for a volume of water. It's not for a percentage of what's in the river. And then what you see again is that if I have rights for 50 acre feet of water in a season, and I hold junior rights, I'm going to get very little of that 50 acre feet in a dry year, while someone with senior water rights might get much closer to their full 50 acre feet of right. All right, so let me just stop here for a minute. So some of the concerns about this kind of flow regime that we currently have are that there are parts of the river system that have much lower than ideal flow at certain times a year. You can imagine that in the upper Deschutes, the very top of the system, in the wintertime, if you only have 100 CFS, you only have 100 CFS worth of habitat. So if you're a fish, you can only populate that chunk of river with 100 CFS worth of fish. if that makes sense. Even though at other times of the year there's a lot of water in that chunk of river, if there's only 100 CFS at a certain point in the year, that's your habitat constraint. Similarly for the middle Deschutes, if there's if there's only 60 to 130 CFS in the middle Deschutes, that's as much fish habitat as you have at certain times of the year. So that's as much fish as you can have. So habitat is a concern. Well, we haven't mentioned the Oregon spotted frog. That is the species that there's a whole bunch of Endangered Species Act action around right now that is driving efforts to essentially increase flow in the upper Deschutes River during the winter months. So altered stream flows, habitat concerns, there are species that we are concerned about. And the other kind of challenge with the system that we have in place right now, with the rights that we have in place and the allocation of those rights, particularly between junior and senior water rights holders, is that there are a whole lot of people who and the river that depend on water that do not have reliability. They have unreliable. The river has unreliable water supply. Farmers have unreliable water supply. Increasingly in the basin, there are domestic water users have unreliable supply too. Okay, and to sort of quantify those needs, this is basically of the water of the unmet needs in the basin. Here's the breakdown of the total amount of water needed. Here's the breakdown of who needs that water. So 80% of the water needed, according to ecological needs analysis, is needed in the river. 20% of the water needed beyond what we have is in agriculture. Again, particularly for those junior water rights holders. So, and there's you'll see this little this interesting little note with an asterisk here in the middle, 12% for municipal and domestic users, and that's tied to the river and stream needs, because currently we have something called a groundwater mitigation system in the Deschutes Basin, whereby a city who needs to get a new water right to dig a new well will acquire and retire surface water rights, typically from agriculture, in order to mitigate their impact. So basically the idea is you put surface water back in the river, or you leave surface water in the river, and then you get to pump water out of the ground. And that was actually a great concept 20 years ago. We are seeing recently that there's challenges with that system because groundwater isn't as abundant as we thought it was 20 years ago. That, I think, is about all I have to say in terms of setting the stage. I hope I didn't cut too much into Phil's time. I'll sit here.
Is it me?
Yeah.
Mm-hmm. Thank you, Phil. Okay, so just so you know, I'm not much of a prepared speaker kind of guy, so you kind of get what you get. But by the way, you all look wonderful in your underwear. So Phil touched on the irrigation districts, and I just wanted to explain. I want to touch on prior appropriation. So we have 7 irrigation districts in the basin. I'm gonna have to read them off because it's hard to, I'll forget somebody, and I got them by date. So you have 3 Sisters, which is up out of Sisters, 7,570 acres, priority date 1895. you've got Swallow Irrigation District, here in Bend, 4,540 acres, 1899. So the dates are the appropriated date. That's when they got their water right, and the earlier your date is, the more senior your right is. Okay, CYD, 44,780 acres, 1,900 water right. Lone Pine, 2,369 acres, 1,900 water right. Tumalo, 7,381 acres, 1,905 right. Arnold, 4,380 acres, 1,905. North Unit, 59,000 acres, 1,913 water right. And then you have Ochoco at 20,330 some odd acres, 1,914 water right. So all of these districts, except for Three Sisters and Ochoco, have basically pulled water out of the Deschutes Basin. Ochoco is important because there are supplemental rights for North Unit on the Crooked River, plus the Crooked River is habitat for Andromeda's fish introduction and various other things. Still important, but for most of what we're talking here, it really doesn't have a lot of bearing on flows in the Deschutes because it's totally separate thing. Of course, it all comes together down in Lake Billy Chinook. Three Sisters, same thing. Ends up down in Lake Billy Chinook, but for what we're talking about, doesn't really do much here. So priority dates, when you hear senior, junior water right users, so you hear a lot about the junior user as far as North Unit and why we're in such a water crunch. It's because we're the junior users. Okay, it's just, in a nutshell, we're last in line. So it's easy to remember, first in time, first in line, right? And then when you talk about the allocation, so what was it, 86% to agriculture, right? So when so everybody else in the basin gets their water first. So they have to get fulfilled before we can tap into ours. It's a bit misleading because we have stored water in Wickiup Reservoir. The problem is, with the drought and things that have been going on, we basically have drained Wickiup a couple of times, come really close. This year was a lot better. We didn't quite drain it. But that's basically our pool of water that we draw off of first. And then we have, yeah.
When you say we, could you tell me?
Oh, North Unit Irrigation District.
Thank
I'm
you.
sorry, when I say we, I'm talking about North Unit.
Thank you.
Phil, do you want the map of the irrigation districts?
No, I'm good. I'm good. They've seen it. So, see, now I lost my train of thought.
Sorry.
The
Okay,
Wickiup
so
reservation,
Wickiup.
sometime you drain it.
Right, so Wickiup, so our water, that's our bucket of water. Okay, so we release water from Wickiup for our needs, goes into the Deschutes River, and we divert it at the diversion in Bend into our canals, and then it goes down to Haystack Reservoir, which is a regulating reservoir, and then it gets distributed to farms. There's a couple of there's a few acreages above Haystack, but most of it's below it. Okay, so that is what we're guaranteed to get for the most part. And then we also have supplemental rights on the Crooked River if the water's there, and then we have primary rights on the Crooked River. So we have pumps in the Crooked River, 9 pumps that can pump 200 CFS as long as the water's there. And then we also have 10,000 acre feet first fill rights in Prime Rule Reservoir. But you have to call on the water, you have to pay on the water, and you have to pump the water. Okay, so the biggest difference between the irrigation districts is your water rights, right? So if you're on natural flow, the rest of them have some storage, but quite a bit of natural flow. And so even if you have senior water rights, there still has to be enough water in the river to fulfill those, right? So it starts from top up. You fill if there's only a percentage of live flow left, then everybody gets a percentage. At least that's what we've been doing lately. And some people get shut off. As you can see, wasn't it last year Arnold got shut off early? Yeah, because they also have storage in Craig Prairie And once that storage is done, and there's no more live flow, which the live flow has been low, then you get shut off. Okay.
There's discussion about North Unit pumping from Billy Chinook and getting that project going. Can you?
I'm gonna touch on that. I've got that kind of last in
Okay.
line.
All right, thank you.
I tend to wander around, so I kind of wrote down so it kind of flows and makes sense a little bit, but I will touch on that. So, see, train of thought. It's my
Hydro
dyslexia kicking
reservoir,
in.
the
So-
percentage of fly flow.
Right, right. So anyway, so once that, I'll get back to the drought, and since I'm talking about live flow. So, and I'm gonna jump around. So 2 years ago was the least amount of water that ever flowed out of the Deschutes Basin, on record. They've been keeping records since the late 1800s. And then, so that was horrible. But last year, after 185% snowpack, roughly, it was the lowest natural flow we'd ever seen. Plus, it was the lowest flows in Fall River ever recorded, which is a spring-fed system, very reliable, year in, year out. Metolius River was flowing at 50%, another very reliable source of water, right? So, I think the elephant in the room that people don't think enough about is the aquifer. And we've seen it here in Deschutes County. I know Phil has mentioned domestic wells drying up. Well, why do wells dry up? Because your water table drops, right? So, moving forward, we will look at all the data as far as North Unit. I'm back to North Unit. We will look at all the data. We'll see how much water is in Wickiup. We'll see the projected natural flows. We'll look at what water is available in Prineville Reservoir, because we do have 10,000 acre feet first fill rights, but it has to get to a certain level to get that water. Last year it was a percentage. Year before it was a percentage. So once again, we're back to, if the water is not available, then you just ratchet it down. You try to spread as much around as you can with what you've got to work with. And so we'll look at all this data, we'll look at snowpack, everything else, and then we'll try to come up with numbers that will tell us roughly how much water we're gonna have for the irrigation season. And then we divide that by however many acres we have, and we see how much water we have to deliver. And then we set allotments, right? So we will, instead of North Unit, traditionally we'll get 2 feet. I say traditionally, it hasn't happened in a while. We'll get 2 feet, but 2 years ago it was 4/10, and last year I think we started out at 6, 7, and then we got some tenths later on. But still less than a foot of water in the high desert trying to grow crops, which is really hard to do. Yes?
I'll be patient if you're gonna answer this later, but my question is, you had talked about last year with snowpack at 150%, and yet the aquifer was extremely low. Can you address why?
So the aquifer, nobody really knows. I don't think. I haven't seen anybody that actually knows. Everything we've projected has been off. I mean, you would have thought with 180% snowpack that your natural flow at least would be fine. Yeah.
The High Desert Museum had a speaker last year who was an expert on glaciers from the U of O, and he mentioned that in Central Oregon our glaciers have disappeared, all but one, and they were basically a holding tank, for want of a better word, so that there was a constant flow of water into the Deschutes from
From the
not
glacier
just the
melt?
snowfields and the snowpack, but including the glaciers. And now that they've gone, in many parts of the world actually, that's why there's such a, not the only reason, but a major reason that our groundwater isn't what it used to be.
That could be. But it's funny because, and God love water resources, they try, and they only have historical data to go on, but, they've been wrong. I mean, the last few years, it's just, we couldn't model for what happened. I mean, the drought was so severe and so extended that it was just unforeseen. We couldn't model it. And so I think as far as the aquifer, I don't know as we really know yet, what's gonna happen. Cause traditionally, the snowpack we have this year is water for next year, not this season, but the next year. So Deschutes Basin is rather unique, and it's not a runoff system. So if you look at California, Sierras get all this snow and it gets 65 degrees and everything floods. It's a runoff system. They capture it in reservoirs because it runs off so quick. Deschutes Basin is different. We get a little bit of runoff. We'll get some effect from some storms and stuff, but most of it goes into the aquifer and it's fed by springs, right? Springs, seeps, creeks. And so it's a unique system. So the aquifer is even more important in the Deschutes Basin as far as what it's doing, because that's basically where water comes from. Yes?
To follow up on my question, is the low water table, true for all of the water districts in the basin?
As far as the aquifer, as far as wells,
Yeah, wells and groundwater that we
I don't
will
know.
count on from now till 20 years from now?
well, Phil would have to. Phil knows.
After Phil just said, well, our Water Resources Department doesn't really know that much, which is sometimes true. I did want to say that the best theory from the Oregon Water Resources Department on why groundwater levels are declining is multiple years of lower than average precipitation, kind of having a cumulative effect over time. So you got 3 years when there's less rain and snow percolating into the ground in the high Cascades, and then you have a year where the Fall River is putting out the lowest amount of water that they've seen in recorded history. So I mean, it is true that water that goes in this year is coming out next year, but water that goes in this year is also probably coming out 2 or 3 years from now too. And you go down to Opal Springs, and water that percolated into the high Cascades hundreds of years ago is coming out. So, so that's
Opal Springs hasn't changed. Opal Springs is still running like it always has.
right. So it had that the effects of a few years of a few dry years hasn't shown up at Opal Springs yet because of the long travel time.
Where's
to get
Opal
there.
Springs?
So it's where Madras gets their domestic water. It's right above the mouth of the Crooked River, about how many river miles? 6? Yeah. So where the Crooked River flows into Lake Billy Chinook, it's upstream from there. It's up. It's basically southwest of Culver, about 10 miles.
So Jefferson County?
Yes. Yeah. And that's where that's where Madras gets its domestic water, which is amazing, by the way. But that's what we're talking about, the aquifers. It's just, I always say it's a big unknown. So traditionally, 180% snowpack, you should see some effect that year, but you're gonna see it the next year especially. But now we're seeing it possibly 2, 3. We don't know how many great winters we're supposed to have. Right now, we're just over 100%, just so everybody knows.
I hate to interrupt your flow, I'm sorry, but
No.
when you say we decide, North Unit doesn't make these decisions. My understanding is that the state water master, and then it trickles down from there, makes the decisions probably in combination with different water districts. Is that correct?
Decision for what?
I'm sorry, for the allocations. Like, we're on Arnold, and we got our water shut off, and then they redecided, and then we got our water turned back on.
Yeah, they
So
figured
somebody
wrong.
decided that.
That was kind of a debacle. And
It was.
somebody missed some calculations along the way. I don't know if it was a decimal point or.
But is it the water, is it the state water
It's
master?
both.
Okay,
It's both. So the water masters are gonna tell you what's available and what goes where.
Mhm.
And then it's up to the districts
Oh.
to manage it.
thank you.
So like, I'll use North Unit for example. So we'll set an allotment. You say you can use this much, this is how much water you have. And then you plan for that accordingly. Okay, Arnold, probably some of the same, a lot of these, so the upper basin districts, I'm not sure about all of them. I'm very familiar with COID, Arnold, and Lone Pine because we all take out at the same place. What they'll do is you have ramp ups. So you can only use a percentage of your water in the early season. They call it shoulder seasons. So you can only use a percentage of your water, be it 50 to, I think it's 50% of what your adjudicated right is. And then it goes up and then it'll be 75% and then 100%. And that's based on the growing season, and long ago they did calculations for crop requirements and what they were growing at the time. And then it's, conversely, it's on the back end too. So they'll have to go to 75% and then 50% on the back end. And these are, COID, Arnold, Lone Pine all have a little bit of storage in Crane Prairies, and we've also traded some. They have some in Wickiup now too. But that's what you see with Arnold, because once they get to a certain point of the year, they can only divert so much, and then they've used their storage, and there's no more water to divert because it's already being taken by senior districts. Okay, usually, so we talk a lot about partnerships, and usually the irrigation districts really try to work together, especially in these trying times. But everybody wants to talk about conservation and water marketing and in-stream leases and buying water. The problem is, when there's a drought, everybody's short. So don't tell anybody in North Unit I said this, but expecting your neighbors who have senior water rights to get you water when your patrons either don't have enough or have the perception they don't have enough, is kind of a tough ask. You know, it's not as simple as that, right? Because I have a unique maybe it's not unique, but my perspective is you hear a lot about the commercial farmers of Jefferson County and the hobby farmers in Deschutes County. You know, people that they don't make their living off the farm, they want the American dream, right? 5 acres, 2 llamas, a car, and a Prius, right? And don't take that, don't get offended by that, really. My uncle has a Prius, and he's from Fort Rock, Oregon. But anyway, you know, my water, I make a living on it. I try to do the best I can with it. It's my livelihood. But by the same token, my water right is no more important to the person that has the 5 acres that wants to raise some cows and do their thing, right? It's no different. My water right maybe has, on a global scale, has a bigger impact, but as far as individually, you know, they're just important. I mean, talk to your realtors, your chamber of commerce. What made Deschutes County? Why people come here, right? Because it's the American dream. It's a great place to be. You can have a ranch. I mean, so I kind of differ from some people in that aspect. So what we're trying to do, and I'm really jumping around now. So we're not trying to take anybody's water. A lot of what we're trying to do in the basin is work to manage the water more efficiently and to be able to move the water around when appropriate, i.e. if somebody has more water than they need or just don't want to use their water, to move that to where it is needed or could be used. I mean, that's a lot of what we're trying to do, and it all comes with, you know, conservation. So when you hear about people talking about conservation and getting water from COID to North Unit, people are like, they're stealing our water. No, what we're doing is we're piping, and then we're taking the conserved water. So every district has carry loss because we run our water through these basalt volcanic ditches that are porous and leak. And so we're piping that. So the water that is available is conserved water. It's the carry water. We're not taking anybody's live water. So if you have, COID actually can divert a lot of water. Their duty is like 7 feet, 6 feet something. Okay, but they've only been using 468 or 478, anywhere, somewhere in there. The last few years, the managers have actually ramped down the water that they've been using. And then part of that is, so they've got water on top of that that they lose by trying to get it to the patrons. And so what we're talking about with all these programs is, it's the conservation water when we're talking about piping and things like that. It's not taking anybody's water. It's taking the water that's not being lost and putting it somewhere where it can be used. That's why, and piping is the most efficient thing. It's also the costliest. But that's why you hear so much about the piping, is because, you know, we have to come up with a big bucket of water in a few years, and that's the biggest bang for the buck. It's a big buck, but as far as the quantities of water that we're gonna need. And there's other programs that go along with it. You know, we've got water marketing, we've got leasing. So the in-stream leasing is interesting. Phil touched on it. So the middle Deschutes basically used to dry up, and I'm talking basically from the river house down. We would basically dry that up. Now COID and DRC are basically the biggest people to thank for there being water in there, because as acres have become urbanized, they've been put in stream. As conservation projects have been done, they've been put in stream permanent, and there's a breakdown. How much, Lisa, how much permanent, how much? We got the experts in the room and they're sleeping.
1/4 temporary and 75% permanent in the middle Deschutes.
Yeah.
So 25% of the water you see in the summer comes from in-stream leasing.
Yeah. And then the other is 75% permanent?
Yeah, which is a mix of permanently buying water as well as the piping conservation that Phil was talking
Yeah.
about.
Very knowledgeable people right there. They're good to have along. Like,
I hate to keep asking questions, but this is kind of a bottom line group, so we only have 15 minutes left, and I'd like to hear your answers and your answers on this question. The bottom line is, what does the Deschutes Basin water future look like, given all the gravitas that we're hearing today? Does it sound like agricultural limits? Does it sound like ongoing litigation forever? Does it sound like population limits? Does it sound like resort and golf course limits? And all of this, of course, you know, the canary in the coal mine is Thornburg. But mostly, I think what we want to hear about, is what's the future. And of course, we can't predict what the weather's gonna look like with climate change, so it's looking pretty dicey. Can you talk to that?
so,
It sounds like
Sure.
10 minutes.
You keep talking, Phil. I'm gonna put this slide up.
Phil has a
People have a
slide.
sense of,
So there's a lot of things that we're doing, a lot of pieces. So we haven't even talked about the HCP yet, which the Habitat Conservation Plan for the Oregon spotted frog that was listed under the Endangered Species Act. That's a big bucket of water that's coming due 2028. That's why there's such an emphasis on piping. So in order to get the amount of water that is required, this is required by the HCP, we have to do some big piping. Or North Unit could possibly go under. I mean, that's just it in a nutshell.
And
But
all the
luckily,
units or just the north unit?
no, just North Unit. Luckily, we've got the partners that are willing to work with us. For one, if you modernize COID, so Central Oregon Irrigation District, I mean, you know, there's 425 CFS available once you pipe the whole district and you modernize COID. That's just the carry water. It's a big district. So the water's there. It's just getting it done. As far as everything else that's going on, I think Arnold is due to be piped, Lone Pine's piping, North Unit is still doing some piping, so I'm focusing on irrigation districts. The Deschutes isn't gonna dry up. The municipalities, as you saw that slide, oh, this is a cool one. As you saw that slide, the municipalities, I mean, the water's there, and what you've seen, and Phil didn't touch on it, but quite a bit of that's urbanized acres. So as land is sold, because the urban growth boundary keeps expanding, and so those acres, they take the water from those acres, the irrigation district basically holds them in perpetuity, and then they either lease them, sell them to the cities either for actual water or put water rights. I mean, the cities actually have some ground that has water rights on it, or they do it for mitigation. So as you continue pumping, it's like, well, we need this much water to offset what we're using for the groundwater. So that's one thing that's going on. I don't know, I'm a farmer, I'm optimistic. North Unit in the short term, so everything we're talking about takes time. And unfortunately, North Unit in the short term, the biggest thing is the weather. I mean, we're farmers, we roll the dice, but that's the biggest thing in the short term, right? All this other stuff is taking time, but we're doing it. I mean, we've got people said it was too big, too much, can't be done, and we're doing it. I mean, as far as the piping, we went and banged on Congress's door. We harassed senators. I think we left the president alone. He was too hard to get to. But we got a big bucket of money, PL 566 money. And it was basically for conservation, for water. And a big chunk of it goes here because we were ready. There's a whole list of criteria that you have to have in place to access this funding. And we were already ahead of the game. We were one of the few places where we had everything in line. Here's our project, this is how much we need, and then you get matching funds and move forward. So I mean, everybody wants to be doom and gloom, but the gloomiest should be North Unit. Because when it comes down to it, most of the districts up here, I mean, except for a couple, they have their water. They may have a little less, but they have their water. I think Arnold is an exception, but Lone Pine had their water. Sioux ID, they have their water. They still got their 4.68 feet. North Unit was at 7/10, but it's all about the junior, senior water rights.
I just wonder, you have not touched on how well your unit is doing conservation things with your crops and all that. You're using
Right.
less water with more value, with more crops than the other units. How do you think these other units are gonna come along and do the same thing you're doing out of necessity, maybe?
So that's a loaded question. No, seriously. So you guys all have yards?
Oh, yeah.
Are they green?
Oh, no.
Do you take care of them?
Brown.
Are they weed free?
Look, no. Just, yeah,
So we're gonna tell a farmer what he can and can't grow and how he's gonna do it? That's the simple answer. I think as time goes on and we pipe and you modernize the irrigation system, and I've always said this, then the conservation will follow. Because once you're piped in an enclosed system and you get, especially if it's pressurized, they're gonna require, they don't really say that now, but that's the only way you're gonna be able to use the water. So as we pipe these districts, you will see the modernization follow and their irrigation practices will change. I mean, we've already seen it with some of the piping projects we've done.
Can you elaborate on that? How would the irrigation?
Okay, so
Implementation.
vast majority of, don't get me wrong, COID has sprinklers, but a vast majority of it is furrow irrigated or flood irrigated. So you basically open a spigot, you run the water, basically the water spreads out, goes down to the end of the field and then drains off, goes somewhere else. As opposed to sprinklers, where you've got a line with a sprinkler, you want a sprinkler, they go like that, right? A little more efficient, a lot more efficient if you don't capture the tailwater. And so if you're in a pipe system, you will probably have some pressure. You may not even have to get an extra pump to run those sprinklers. Chances are if you want to run quite a few, like a pivot or something, you'll have to have a booster pump. But if it's in an enclosed system, it builds pressure. And so, you know, that's the way you're going to use the water. And I think at some point they will require doing the sprinkler thing.
Isn't Sisters already doing a pressurized system, weren't they,
Yeah.
ahead of the curve?
Yep.
And so it's almost like instead of having a holding pond that we're all familiar with seeing, it's like turning on a tap.
Yep.
So you build up your own pressure.
Yep. Well, it depends.
I know.
Some places don't have any
Sisters.
pressure, but most time if you're in a pipe, you'll have some kind of pressure. So that's why I'm saying the irrigation practices will probably have to change at that point. You know, so you want to talk about, so the one thing about North Unit, and it's back to what we've done, even with the furrow irrigation, if you go to North Unit and you don't see this, and it's out of necessity, don't get me wrong, the COID, they don't have to because they've always had the water, right? It's out of necessity for us because we didn't have the water because we're junior. So we will do the furrow irrigation, it will go into a catch pond, we'll have a pump, we'll pump it back up to the top end and we'll reuse it. We'll just keep reusing that water. We actually installed a pivot, a landlord and I did this year, 160 acres of furrow irrigated. And then I've got another, I'm down to roughly 74 acres of furrow irrigated ground. But the tailwater all goes to my son or I. So we have ponds. So basically, a lot of what goes on in North Unit is we recycle what water we have. So I will water furrow irrigation, if you do it correctly and capture the water, especially with the wind we have, because you do not have the wind skips. For some crops, it works a lot better than overhead irrigation as far as like sprinklers, right? But what we do is we'll water that and then we'll coordinate it because we've got pumps with sprinklers on the end of it, and it either goes one or two directions, and we can capture that in those ponds and then we reuse it. And you see a lot of that in North Unit. We basically maximize the least efficient irrigation system we have to its full capability. So it's, you know, and then, so we got most of it's sprinklers, and then with some crops now, we're doing drip, especially with carrots. We're doing drip irrigation, and, you know, that's, it's misleading though, because carrots, you basically have to water them 4 times in the fall. So, I mean, you water them with your sprinklers, or flooding them, trying to get them up 4 times, and then you put your drip in the spring. So in the overall picture, yes, they use less water through the summer, but they still consume quite a bit of water, even with drip. I mean, there has been some experimentation with drip in the fall, but it's tough to make it work just because the drip tape isn't as durable as we'd like. Mm-hmm.
So back to the question back here on the future of water, and could we hear from Phil, because the question was asked of both of them. I don't know if we want to hear from Phil on that, but I'd like to.
For example, what's the future of Thornburg?
Yeah. So
I'll let you tackle that.
there's
I know that.
It's really important to understand that no one should be wasting water. No one. Not farmers with senior irrigation rights, not farmers with junior irrigation rights can't waste water, right? Not urban residential properties, not destination resort properties, but in the scale of the whole system, it's really important to understand that the canal piping projects that we've mentioned today, the on-farm efficiency work that can happen, that saves hundreds of thousands of acre-feet of water per year. Thornburg, which I can only talk about so much because apparently the state court of appeals is sending Thornburg back to us again.
Really?
So as a commissioner, I'm only allowed to.
Careful.
I can't talk. I need to act in a quasi-judicial role in relation to that land use application. So I can basically just kind of tell you history, but or kind of commonly known factual stuff. But Thornburg is going to use less than 2,000 acre-feet a year of water at the build out that they've proposed. So when you have opportunities to save hundreds of thousands of acre-feet of water a year, and someone is saying, well, if you don't do this, then you could save 2,000. It's not necessarily the lowest hanging fruit in terms of what do we do to improve our water supply reliability. Again, I would say that no one should be wasting water, and could you support 1,900 homes with less water than that? I certainly think so. The aquifer really, I think, is the concern. So from my perspective, we know what we need to do in agriculture, and we know what we need to do in terms of surface water. We need to do canal piping, we need to do on-farm efficiency, and then we need some flexibility in the way that our water rights system works in order to move that conserved water around to where it's needed. So we just need to do more of that, and then we need that little bit of flexibility. In terms of groundwater, that's actually what I'm most concerned about in our region, because of lower than average precipitation over the last couple decades, and we're seeing it in places like the head of the Metolius and the head of the Fall River, and in wells that are going, shallow wells that are going dry, individual domestic wells that are going dry around the county. Our groundwater levels are declining, and no one has shown me yet that they have a plan to slow or reverse those groundwater level declines. And that's, so I think in terms of policy making, that's one of the things that we really need to be working on a lot in the next couple of years.
Thank you.
Okay. Do meters come into play, or is that a dirty word?
Yes,
For
For
agricultural
farmers,
users
for-
or for
urban
municipal users?
Everybody who's using water.
There's a very famous phrase, you can't manage what you can't measure.
Right.
So, meters are the way that we would measure, measure what people are using. And, I'm pretty sure that North Unit, pretty much every farmer is metered in North Unit.
Is that true? Yeah, I didn't know that.
North Unit, every drop is measured. So unlike so I never even got that far. The irrigation districts, how they deliver water are not all the same. So in North Unit, we are demand system, so we call up or log on, and we order so much water, and then they come out and they adjust the head gate, they measure it, and then we either have a head gate or we have a meter, and they measure it to make sure that's the amount of water we get. And then you use it for however long you need it till you're done with your irrigation cycle, and then you have it shut off. So everything in North Unit is, for lack of a better term, metered. Some of the others are on rotations. The ditch is always full. It's your turn, right? And so they know how much water is going in, but not necessarily how much water each user's using. It depends on what's going on, what ditch you're on. They have a good idea, but that's not quite the same. So yeah, North Unit, we know exactly how much water we use. We also, conversely, we know how much water we lose, as far as, you know, we've got, what, 300 miles of ditches and canals, 260. So, I mean, there's potential there for quite a bit of loss that we're constantly working on. But the reason COID comes up for the piping is there's just so much more water to be gained in COID. Just on conservation side. I think the total in North Unit is a little over 200 CFS, and they're 425 at about and about half the cost. I mean, it's all expensive, but we would be $1 billion just because of where we're at. It's all that rock and everything else. Yeah.
So it's all this new pressurized pipe that they're installing, which I do approve of, but is it required to be metered then for every user?
Well, they would have to. Yeah.
I mean, is it, if you're using that pressurized pipe, do you have to have it metered then?
Yeah. You would have to meter it, or else you can't keep track of who's getting
So
what.
that's part of the system?
Yep.
Okay.
That's what I've always said, and people are the naysayers. Well, how are they? No. Once you get the conservation done, the on-farm will follow. And maybe not all of it. You know, you might have a little valve and you put it in a pipe and you still do what you do, but most of it, you're gonna see the conservation. Just being in a pipe by itself, it conserves 400 and some. Once it's all piped, there's 420 CFS conserved right there. So that's 840 acre feet a day.
One of the challenges will be, so in more urbanized irrigation districts like COID, there you have groups of properties that used to be one big farm. Yeah. And so you have a canal, or now you have a pipe that runs by, and you still have a ditch that comes off of that to 6, 10, 12 properties, until you not just have that main pipe, main canal pipe, but also a lateral canal piped, then you couldn't really check on what each of those farmers is using, and they're basically just working it out among themselves to make sure that what comes out of the main pipe, they are sharing appropriately so that people get what they're supposed to. But there's definitely additional water savings to be had by piping that lateral as well as the main canal. And then when you've got pressurized water to every single property, then they can do all kinds of sprinkler systems and things like that to do the on-farm efficiency.
Yeah, I always said efficiency. So I had a question earlier, and I see time-wise, but I would like to touch on it. So the lake, well, you've been reading about Lake Billy Chinook. So North Unit has 9 pumps in the Crooked River. River mile 12, right? About 6 miles. 6 miles upstream from Opal Springs, somewhere there. Yeah. That's Kate Fitzpatrick, by the way. She's the director of DRC. Knows a lot more about a lot of this stuff than I do. I know dirt, she knows water and things like that. Okay, so lost my train of thought. I introduced you. Yeah, okay, so Lake Billy Chinook. So we've got 9 pumps in the Crooked River. And we have a 200 CFS supplemental right, and then we have roughly left now about 4,800 acres of primary water rights. So we have so much water that has to go on, that we have some Crooked River acres that are specific to the Crooked River in our district. And so we have to pump that water for those acres out of the Crooked River, plus we have the supplemental. So the Lake Billy Chinook project, what we're proposing is taking those pumps, and probably just getting rid of those pumps because, they're 40 years old, but putting a pumping station in Lake Billy Chinook proper, down below the mouth of the Crooked River and where everything comes into Lake Billy Chinook. So it would be basically 400 CFS, because we've got the 200 that we can pump as our primary right for crooked rivers. And then there's some other stuff going on that we're getting a little ahead of ourselves there but there's another couple hundred CFS that could be available. Plus, we have the 10,000 acre feet in Prineville, which we can pump when we call on it. So it's a unique opportunity for us, and I think it, but I'm just a humble dirt farmer. I think it, environmentally, it checks all the boxes, because we're in the unique situation where we can run all our water through the habitat and then use it. So the water that we normally would use, or the water we're ordering out of Prineville, or even the Deschutes, we could run some of it clear down the Deschutes. We run it clear through, all the way through the habitat, and then we pick it up, and we don't have to worry about the Andromeda's fish introduction, which is salmon and steelhead, which is ongoing in the Crooked River right now. They just found a mussel that they're kind of talking about. We already know about a frog. Anyway, so it's a unique opportunity. The problem is it's really expensive. It's been done other areas, but it would bring drought resiliency to North Unit. It wouldn't cure the drought, but it would sure help the cause, as far as, because Lake Billy Chinook is huge, and the amount of water we would take, it really wouldn't even hardly be noticed. It wouldn't even be an inch off the surface if we were pumping 200 CFS. I mean, the whole lake would drop just minuscule. So all water is important, but you really would hardly even notice it as far as Lake Billy Chinook. So what we did was, I had to write this down. So we just went through a pre-feasibility study. So it's an analysis to determine if it's feasible to study it more. For lack of a better way to say it. It's very confusing. And then it sounds like, from what we've heard, it sounds like that has gone well, and they're going to recommend an actual feasibility study. And it looks like the Bureau will probably put in a bunch of money to get that done. So
would that be paid for by the water district or by all of us?
By all of us. It would take infrastructure money, basically.
Isn't that
I
federal?
don't know if the irrigation districts.
Isn't that federal?
Yeah.
You're a federal tax
Which
dollar,
is all
so-
of us, yeah.
I mean, and which is what built, which is what built Wickiup Reservoir and Bowman Dam and all these other places in the first place.
They just got it done over on the Columbia. It's big infrastructure money.
Is the tribal government of Warm Springs involved in these talks?
Yes, they have to be. We can't do anything without them.
Good to know, thank you.
And they are great partners.
Yes, thank you.
So you've heard a lot about the Klamath and what goes on down there, and how everybody's fighting, and they're fighting about dams, and I have no issue with your stance on that, but they've been at odds, right? They have fought tooth and nail against each other. They've sued, they've countersued. The tribes have won, but luckily we have such a great relationship with the Confederated Tribes of Warm Springs. We got sued by Water Watch and Center for Biological Diversity about the spotted frog. They wanted injunctive relief. And if you looked at it, they wanted all the water. Josh Newton stood up there, the attorney for the Confederated Tribes, and said, this isn't right. We're not litigious. We collaborate. We have the oldest rights, and we're good with collaborating and going forward because we look at the long picture. I could have went up and hugged him. In fact, I hugged Bobby Bruno. But that was so powerful. And if you haven't noticed, tribes don't lose in federal court. I mean, they have,
They've already lost.
Yes, exactly,
They've already
exactly,
lost a
so.
long time ago.
So a lot of times, so I was on the North Unit Irrigation District Board for 19 years. I'm the one that helped negotiate the habitat conservation plan. Did a lot of outreach. But the one thing you always consider, and I always consider, is what's the tribe's take on it? Because they trump us all.
In Arizona, they call those immemorial water rights. Do we have those here, or is it
They're,
an
they're,
undercurrent?
they're rights held immemorial.
Right,
Yes.
so they're like number one in
Yeah,
Arizona.
yeah, they're number one here.
Okay.
Yeah, they trump us all. If they call for all the water, they trump us all.
And then there was the, thing that they couldn't overturn senior water rights past 1955.
Yeah.
So they can trump us all, but they've lost in state court.
Well, but they're on the lower, theirs is for fish and everything else, and so they aren't as long as the fish are taken care of, they're good. And so as long as we all do our part and take care of the fish, and that's why that pumping station, so I don't wanna get too much in the weeds because tribal council they're on board, but they're willing to actually commit because we're talking about water. But they know what's going on. We keep them apprised of everything we're doing and the studies and, yeah, the Confederate tribes have been great partners. And they literally, in that, litigation, they saved our butt. I mean, Judge Aiken was like, hey, you guys are collaborating, you're working on it. No, let's let them do what they're doing.
If I could just add, one of the really important things to understand about the collaboration that's happening in the Deschutes Basin is that the tribe started it. The tribe were a central partner in creating the Deschutes River Conservancy. The tribes have played a really important role in all of the collaborative efforts. The current incarnation of collaboration that we've got right now, the Deschutes Basin Water Collaborative. Bobby Bruno is he was the original chair of that group, and then he asks to have an irrigation district and a domestic water representative to co-chair with him, and I'm filling one of those chairs. But the tribes have always they're not just good collaborators, they have set the tone that all of us kind of work within, and that's a really important thing to understand about collaboration in the Deschutes Basin.
Well, and Bobby is the president of the board for DRC at this time, so very involved.
Can I just make an announcement? A lot of league members have asked about how we can help in Warm Springs, and I have a little piece of paper out there. I talked to Bobby Bruno, and he gave me a website you can go to if you want to donate. He didn't ask for any.
For their water
For their
issues.
drinking water problems.
Yeah, they've been having some real
And there's
issues.
another-
They did get a big chunk of money to start fixing it though, so they're in better shape than they were last year.
But the piping that goes to the plant is all just
Yeah.
completely
Yeah,
discombobulated.
yeah. I don't know if it was enough money to
It's
fix
not.
the whole thing,
It's not.
but they did
They
get,
can't access the water
There's
to
another
their
piece of
homes,
paper out there
5,000
too.
homes can't access the water.
yeah.
So the new treatment plant is kind of a moot point. We're having a letter writing campaign here on the 23rd on behalf of Warm Springs to 7 federal agencies to fund the piping.
Is
Yeah.
that the league who's doing it?
No,
The league?
no,
Well,
the DEIG group here at the union.
Yeah, they can do,
Oh, okay.
they can do a big chunk of it, but it wasn't enough to do everything they wanted to do or need to do is the problem. But they can get a good start on getting a lot of it online.
There's another piece of paper out there also about the newest Oregon Water Resources Division meeting, which will talk about groundwater if you're interested. Two
Yeah.
pieces, one on the tribes and the other on groundwater meeting.
So one thing I would mention is, most of what I talk about is surface water. So in North Unit Irrigation District, I think there's only 2 wells. One's on my place, and it was a domestic well that was capped years ago, because they were fighting over it, they were all related. Imagine that. But so mostly what I talk about is surface water. The wells, we just don't have that much, and even the wells we do have are emergency wells. You can't just irrigate out of them. You have to have a drought declaration. You have to have water shortage, and then you can use your emergency well. Anyway.
So the water districts,